For my honors thesis project, I have chosen to examine the artistic project and practice of American photographer Cindy Sherman. Throughout her career, Sherman has tested the limits of her chosen medium by turning the camera on herself, assuming the role of both artist and subject. Moreover, beyond merely modeling for her own photographs, Sherman mobilizes performance as a mechanism for representation. In my thesis, I argue that performance assumes the role of Sherman's primary medium, while photography serves as a device for documenting these performances. My paper also suggests that her method of performance art acts primarily as a self-development project rather than as a social commentary, at least initially. As her early works are perhaps most revealing of the forces that initially compelled Sherman to perform and act as a quintessential representation of her early artistic project at work, I have chosen to focus my thesis on an examination of Sherman's first professional body of work, her series Untitled Film Stills, from 1977 to 1980. The series consists of 70 black and white photographs in which Sherman makes both direct and indirect cinematic references, and, quite notably, Sherman features as the sole subject in each film still in her series. She takes on a variety of personalities and personas, dressing in costumes, wigs, and makeup that she uses to develop this range of characters. Here I've included a selection of film stills, and you may see for yourself the diversity contained within this series. In my paper, I discuss the ways in which Sherman's upbringing and college years compelled her to perform. Sherman had 4 siblings and was the youngest by far. She describes the ways in which she used dress-up and performance to overcome shyness from a young age and assert her presence to her family. I also explore Sherman's years at the State University College of Buffalo, where she gained exposure to conceptualism and was introduced to the works of performance artists like Eleanor Antin, Susie Lake, and Hannah Wilke. The piece shown here was made for a class assignment at Buffalo and can be viewed as a blueprint for Sherman's serial and performance pursuits in Untitled Film Stills. As mentioned earlier, I ultimately argue that performance serves as Sherman's primary medium in her film stills. However, photography was an important tool employed by many performance artists for the purposes of documenting their works. Therefore, this assertion commands a discussion about the ways in which the series departs from traditions of performance art. Many performance artists who worked at the same time as Sherman, like Adrian Piper and Chris Burden, shown here, mobilize chance in their performances. The unknown and uncontrollable outcome of a performance art piece, and the reliance on audience engagement or participation in the work, was part of what made that work successful. However, unlike these artists, Sherman exercised total control over her performances and performed alone for her camera. Accordingly, it is apparent that Sherman's intervention of photography takes place at a later stage in her production process. I want to further illustrate the ways in which Sherman's photographs depart from the practice of photographic documentation employed by other performance artists of the time by briefly addressing the following question. If Sherman's Untitled film stills operate primarily as works of performance art, what status do they maintain as successful works of photography? Sherman embraced the capabilities of photographic technology in artistic ways. According to curator Eva Spini, in developing the first 6 film stills, Sherman purposely caused reticulation in the negatives, a grainy effect that results when one chemical bath is very different in temperature from the preceding one. There is a telling double paradox here. Sherman did this with the intent of making the pictures look technically poor, yet only someone with a knowledge of film developing would understand that such a flaw could be deliberately introduced. You can see this technique shown here in Untitled Film Still number 5. Accordingly, it is apparent that while Sherman's primary medium is performance, she uses photography in ways that merit her film stills recognition as works of photography as well. Finally, it is also important to consider the role that the cultural moment in which Sherman worked played in the reception of the film stills. In the 70s and 80s, political and social movements dominated much of popular discourse, and it is therefore no surprise that many critics took Sherman's Untitled Film Stills, a series of photographs which capture a wide range of female personalities and stereotypes, as confirmation of certain progressive theories of the time. For instance, many viewed Sherman's practices of self-objectification confirmative of feminist theory. Similarly, in her essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, the feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey unpacks the gendered structures of voyeurism subjectification and what she refers to as the male gaze. Sherman's works, as featured here, can be viewed as an exploration or even illustration of the ideas Mulvey introduces. However, Sherman has said that she was not aware of the male gaze and these specific ideas when she produced the film stills. Therefore, I suggest that her Untitled Film Stills served as more of a self-discovery project and exploration of performance than as an illustration of specific theoretical ideas circulating in the 70s and 80s. This is, of course, not to say that Sherman was not informed by theoretical ideas, as we know she was. Her embrace of ambiguity, of inviting a multitude of interpretations and escaping the narrative implications of titling the photographs in this series, has allowed this series to maintain relevance to this day. It has also helped Sherman create a unique position for herself in the histories of performance art and photography. This image from a 1981 photograph from Sherman's Centerfold series was sold for over $3 million in 2011, securing the position of most expensive photograph that had sold up to that time. Untitled Film Stills, a body of work which gained Sherman critical success from a young age, has allowed her to develop a unique working style, many aspects of which she has continued to employ through the present, and achieve iconic status as a photographer and performance artist. Thank you.
Hi everyone! The title of my thesis is Privileging the Photograph in Xingwei Yishu, the Political, Legal, and Transactable Conditions of Contemporary Chinese Performance Art. In my thesis, I focused on examining and problematizing the status of the photograph and its particular trajectory through contemporary Chinese performance art. So basically, I argue that contemporary Chinese performance art privileges the photograph over the performance for a number of socio-political and economic reasons. Focusing on the photograph was initially driven by politically motivated criticism, as well as pragmatic matters of documentation and circulation. And finally, using photography as the primary way to present performance art was also propelled by the development of copyright law in mainland China. Policies of economic reform also supported a burgeoning market for Chinese contemporary art. And in a sense, contemporary Chinese performance art can be understood in two ways. First, we can think of it as a sort of resistance to the political conditions that suppressed it. Second, we can think of it as an embrace of these very same conditions and socio-economic institutions that have led these artists and their performances to critical and commercial success. These artists, such as Zhang Huan pictured here, sought to distinguish themselves through radical performances. However, suppression of performance art that led to the privileging and commodification of the photograph ultimately rendered the provocations impotent. It's important to ask whether we should think about contemporary Chinese performance art first through the medium of performance or through the medium of photography. We could understand the photograph as a lasting record of an ephemeral performance, as a mediated experience of a past event. But we could also think of these artists as conceptualizing actions as source material for their desired photographs. Zhang Huan situated his performance in a museum space that served as both the site of production and display. By doing so, he offered a promise of immediacy for those invited to be a part of the audience. Unfortunately, however, the performativity and staging of the performance ultimately overshadowed the live experience of being part of an on-site audience. In fact, he frequently interrupted the performers to capture posed photographs, such as the one seen here. This demonstrated that Zhang's focus was not on the live event, but rather on its photographic documentation for posterity, something that we might call performing for the camera. This illustrates how photography can subvert the hierarchy between the supposed primacy of performance and the mediation of documentation. The development of art in a historical environment so hyper-focused on socialism with Chinese characteristics was unique. In other words, the creation of art amidst economic policies that endorsed variations of socialist ideology and corporate capitalism. Copyright legislation in mainland China was enacted in 1990. However, state-sponsored criticism of performance art meant that, in practice, it was quite difficult for these artists to benefit from copyright protection. Performance art was often criticized for being too obscene, for depicting scenes of nudity, for example, such as Ma Liuming's work pictured here. Of course, artists such as Zhang Huan and Ma Liuming have since attained widespread critical and commercial success, despite such limitations in mainland China. For example, Zhang Huan's My Boston took place in Boston at the MFA, and his photographs were sold in the inaugural Chinese Contemporary Art Sale at Sotheby's Hong Kong in 2004. This was, in a way, a strategy to establish both cultural and appraisable value for contemporary Chinese performance art. By making prices public record through sales in an auction house and integrating his performances into institutional programs, contemporary Chinese performance art asserts its value fiscally and on an international scale culturally. This renders domestic criticism less relevant in a sense. So to conclude, these artists have subtly leveraged the art market to grant their performance art greater value in the public eye. This serves as grounds for rethinking the radical countercultural reputation of contemporary Chinese performance art. Thank you.
My thesis considers the work of Doug Rickard, a contemporary photographer who appropriates images from the internet. Rickard spent 2 years trawling through Google Street View in search of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States, where he found a trove of evocative digital imagery showcasing a particular quality of American poverty, its simultaneous invisibility to the wealthy, and its hypervisibility to the eye of surveillance. When he found scenes he liked, he photographed his computer screen in a dark room, and then photoshopped the images to remove all Google insignias. They look, many critics have said, like Walker Evans's photographs from the Great Depression. I came across this comparison between Rickard and the FSA photographers again and again in my research. Aaron O'Toole, curator of photography at SF MoMA, makes the comparison, as does independent curator David Campany. It didn't quite sit right with me. Firstly, these critics meant the comparison to be flattering of Rickard's social mission, to show poverty as raw and, more than anything, human. But I took Rickard's similarity to these bigwigs of social documentary photography to itself be a failing. Following Martha Rossler's critique of humanizing as a fundamentally liberal mode of engaging with systematically neglected subjects, I wondered, what good is a project that humanizes the urban poor without allowing us to see the structures that produced their photographed abjection? With this critique of humanization in mind, I came to understand so much of Rickard's work as reliant on ideas of empathy, the power of the individual, and in turn, neoliberal principles in urban planning and techno-utopianism. These were the central threads of my thesis. I examined how the two components of Rickard's work, urban disinvestment and techno-surveillance, relied on similar logics of personal freedom and interactivity that continue to govern our increasingly privatized world today. I examined these strands through a number of histories, but I will share two particularly evocative artifacts from my research today. They are histories that, I think, emerge quite powerfully in Rickard's work, even if he isn't aware of it. The first artifact is an early precursor to Google Street View that demonstrates the relationship between urban environments and the technology that represent them. Created in 1977 by the Architecture Machine Group at MIT, the Aspen movie map filmed the streets of Aspen, Colorado. Researchers then compiled the footage into a virtually navigable map. Much like Rickard, the user of the Aspen movie map sat in a dark room navigating a place he'd likely never been. I'd like to specifically highlight the deeply personalized nature of the Aspen movie map's interface. The user made his own world through an interface that he built through his own use. The tool was originally intended for use by the military, but became mobilized in American urban planning departments when the inner city was increasingly being figured in the language of war and crisis. For urban planners to navigate cities on a computer screen then, rather than in real life, was an undoubtedly conservative practice. The history of virtual world-making was tied up, I concluded, with the history of urban disinvestment. As early as 1977, technological interactivity had begun to replace citizen engagement. Jump to 2015. Google has undergone a corporate restructuring so that now the search giant is part of Alphabet, a sort of super Google parent company. Under Alphabet's umbrella is Google Street View, the tool we know well, and Sidewalk Labs, a real estate development company that was building a neighborhood from scratch on Toronto's waterfront until just last week, when the project was abruptly canceled. In the crystal clear language of corporate structure, we see again that the way the built environment is developed and the way that it is rendered digital are hard to disentangle. In particular, the nature of smart cities, like those Sidewalk Labs hopes to build, are such that people, by way of their smartphones, serve as passive data points in the service of a totally computerized city, with real-time updates on trash pickup or stormwater overflow. Technological interactivity has almost entirely subsumed public good, with a corporation acting as the sole progenitor of urban life. What does all of this mean for Rickard's work? I understand the project as indeed a rearticulation of the goals of the FSA, but at the same time as a regurgitation of the privatization and personalization endemic to Google. I began to see humanization and social documentary photography as rehearsing logic central to corporate power in the American urban landscape. While certainly for many artists, over-identification with a political problem is a critical strategy, I found myself struggling to see what Rickard's critique was precisely beyond the fact that poverty is sad to look at. With this in mind, I came away from my thesis thinking about alternative strategies that figure forth a more robust critique of surveillance capitalism, which I would be happy to speak about in the Q&A portion.